Hi, this is Andre. I want to talk about the SUS insert function in the Echoplex Digital Pro. This video is brought to us by Mark Oswald, one of my Patreon supporters who commissioned this particular video, so thanks very much, Mark. The SUS insert mode is similar to the insert mode, which we talked about in part 1 of the insert series. The difference here is that the SUS insert mode is only active for as long as you hold down the button. So here's an initial loop. And here's the SUS insert mode. So as long as you're holding the button down, SUS insert will add new content into the loop and expand the length of the loop around that new content. As soon as you release the insert button, it stops doing that. So if you look at the display, let's call up a new loop and start from scratch. You can see it starts displaying cycles, but as soon as you release it, the cycle display goes away. That's because this is basically an unrounded insert function. It doesn't round to cycles the way the standard insert function does. It basically extends the length of the loop for as long as you're holding down the button, which could be a long time, or it could be a few milliseconds. So in its default state, the SUS insert function is unrounded. It doesn't work on a cycle-by-cycle basis. Now let's look at this in a little more detail. To access the SUS insert function, we're going to come down to the parameter row, the insert mode, and it's labeled as SUS, S-U-S. Now let's talk about this. There are a lot of SUS-type functions available in the Echoplex. When you access this particular SUS parameter, this is for the insert mode. So we have a lot of different insert mode values here. There are 7 different insert modes. Part 1 of the insert series was talking about this one, insert. That builds based off of cycles. So if we start with an initial loop, would help if I turn up the volume. If we start with an initial loop, if we use insert in its toggle mode, then we're adding on the basis of new cycles. That kind of idea. But if we switch the insert mode to SUS and start up a new initial loop with our guitar volume up, then this is only going to expand the loop length for as long as the button is held down. So keep that in mind. There are a few different Echoplex functions that have SUS variations. Record mode has a toggle and a SUS, and a safe. Overdub has a toggle and a SUS as well. So SUS is a parameter option that's available on a lot of different functions on the EDP, especially if you use MIDI control. But when we talk about the SUS function in this particular video, in the insert mode, we're talking about a SUS version of the insert mode. We're talking about a SUS version where the length of the loop is expanded by however long this button is being pressed down for. Let's compare this to the replace function, because at first glance they have very similar flavors. Let's start up a new loop from scratch. Now let's call up the replace function. This is also a SUS function. It's also momentary. So have a listen to this. Now, if you compare that to the SUS insert mode, at first glance they're very similar. Here's the SUS insert mode. You could easily be forgiven at first glance for not really hearing a substantial difference between the effect. The difference is that SUS insert expands the length of the loop. Every time I depress the button for SUS insert, the loop is getting longer. Sometimes by just a few milliseconds at a time, sometimes for several seconds. But sus insert is always expanding the length of the loop. Replace doesn't change the length of the loop. It overwrites content in the loop, but the loop length stays exactly the same. So if you watch this display as I'm using the replace function, the loop never changes length. So yeah, at face value they can get very, very similar kinds of glitchy, stuttery effects. The main difference, again, is that the sus insert mode is going to expand the length of the loop. The sus replace function keeps the loop length exactly the same and just overwrites material. The sus insert function actually moves the loop apart. So if I record something that's a little more straightforward, then I switch back to the sus insert mode. Now I'm going to add another note right before that. 2, 3. So I didn't cover up any of the notes that were in the previous loop. I just expanded the length for the length of time that I was pressing this button down. That kind of idea. Now let's talk about using quantize with the sus insert mode. Let's switch quantized to cycle. Now we've been talking about how in its default unquantized state, the sus insert mode is unrounded. When you activate cycle quantization, it becomes a rounded function. Let me demonstrate. Let's start off with a short loop length. As soon as I tap the insert button, it's going to insert a new cycle's length of time. It's going to happen right at the beginning of the new cycle point, and it's going to give us exactly one cycle of new material, and then it's going to stop. That kind of idea. So it's a step sequencer kind of sound. It's similar to the 8th quantized replace technique that we talked about a couple of videos back. Let me demonstrate that very quickly. Quantize set to 8th, insert mode set to replace, record a loop, and with quantized replace, each replace button start and end point is mapped to a cycle division. So you get this very tightly rhythmically locked effect. So again, this is a good example of something that at face value is very similar to another Echoplex function, but when you dig into it, it's a little deeper. The difference here with using sus insert and cycle quantization is that you're building the loop on a cycle by cycle basis. With the 8th quantized replace technique, the loop length stays the same, and you're doing replaces within the length of that loop. With this technique, with the sus insert quantized effect, you're starting with a loop length initially. It could be very short. Let's do a very short loop length. And then you're adding onto the length of the loop on a cycle by cycle basis. Oh, I forgot to change to sus. That's replace. Operator error. Let's try that again. There we go. So everything that's being inserted is a new cycle. And because quantize is set to cycle, each sus insert function is being mapped to the length of one cycle. If I just tap it, it'll still give me one cycle's worth of time. So let's do a bit of that. So a similar kind of effect, but you're building it on a cycle-by-cycle basis. That also means that you can change the length of the loop. You'll remember from a couple of videos ago that if the insert mode is set to sus, then multiply also becomes a sus function. So multiply is going to be active for as long as I hold it down. So between that and the sus insert, you can get all kinds of crazy stuff happening on a cycle-by-cycle basis that is completely locked in and quantized. There we go. All right, lots of fun to be had. Now let's look at what happens if quantize is set to 8th. And this is a really, really interesting effect if you're using sus insert. Quantize is set to 8th. Let's record an initial loop. So right there, these are our divisions of the cycle. The exact value is 8. And if you're familiar with the previous videos that have talked about 8th quantization, that means that functions are going to be mapped to the nearest one of these. Now here's where it gets crazy. The sus insert function expands the length of the loop. 8th quantization maps a function to one of the divisions of the loop. The thing is, as soon as you expand the length of the loop, the value of a division of the loop changes. It's crazy! I'm going to shut up and show you what that's like. So do you hear how the fragments are getting a little longer? Because each time you do a sus insert, you're expanding the length of the loop, which means that the division of the loop is getting longer because the overall loop length is getting longer. So each fragment is very tightly locked, but the fragments are also getting gradually longer because they're quantizing to divisions of the loop, and each time you use that function, you're expanding the loop length. Sorry to geek out. Now, if we do a sus multiply, that's going to follow one of those divisions as well. Let's see what happens. That shortened the length of the loop, so now each of those divisions is shorter. And now we've gotten a loop that's so short that it no longer tracks divisions. So a little longer and we should be in, there we go. We're back in business now. So on the one hand, it's very rhythmic. On the other hand, it's not a constant groove. As you keep changing the length of the loop, you're changing the value of the division of a cycle. That means that each successive use of one of these functions is going to be at a different length. So it's totally locked in, and it's also totally abstract and random. All right. Now let's check out quantizing to loop when using the sus insert function. Let's get an initial loop length, and let's try this. So each time you use a quantized sus insert that is quantized to loop, you're effectively doubling the length of the loop. Let's build it from scratch again. Now it's a 2-cycle loop. Now if we hit it again, it'll become a 4-cycle loop. Now it's an 8-cycle loop. This will be a 16-cycle loop. So sus insert does a lot of different types of things depending on how quantize is set. In its most basic sense, it makes stuff sound crazy in the best possible way. This is not the end of the insert function. There's a third volume which is actually going to deal with a particularly weird combination of functions that I use a whole lot, and we're going to get to that very shortly. In the meantime, though, this is a crash course on the sus insert mode, which is a sus version of the insert mode, all of which are accessed by the insert button. Clear as mud. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to Mark Oswald for commissioning the tutorial. I will talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.